It's Saturday, the 1st of September 1666, and Thomas Farriner is stooped over his oven, raking through the coals. Thomas is a baker, and he's been hard at work all day. Sunday is his only day off, and he's looking forward to the rest. Since waking up at dawn, he's spent the day baking not only the usual bread for his regular customers, but a special order of hardtack. A victualler, working on commission for the Navy Board, comes to collect the ship's biscuit regularly. Thomas is proud that he is helping to feed the sailors of the Royal Navy, though he wouldn't want to eat any of the stuff himself. It's baked so hard that they'll need to soak it in water before they can even nibble on it. The bells of his parish church, St. Magnus the Martyr, had rung out an hour earlier at 9 o'clock, and Thomas's family was carrying out their nightly routine. Pots of meat were prepared as a Sabbath treat for after the morning's worship. The wood fuel for the next week is brought inside and left by the oven to air. Thomas, or maybe his apprentice son, also named Thomas, will go over the books and see how the week's takings had been. And of course, church in the morning. Thomas was a church warden before the plague carried off his wife last year, and he still had responsibilities to his parish. Many of his unsold loaves will be taken to St. Magnus to be given out to the poor. Satisfied that the fires were extinguished, Thomas closes the metal door to the last oven. He has 5 in his bakery. There are still embers smouldering in one grate, but they'll go out soon, and they'll keep the autumn chill out. After checking that the doors and windows are properly closed, the Farriners go upstairs to their living space. They're still awake 2 hours later when Hannah Farriner, Thomas's daughter, comes back down to light a candle. Her father told her to try the oven, but the embers are so faded, Hannah can't get the wick to light. She goes back upstairs, and the family goes to sleep. 2 hours after that, Thomas wakes up coughing, and when he opens his eyes, he struggles to make anything out. It isn't just the darkness of the bedroom. Thick smoke is rising through the floorboards and under the door. Over the coughing of his family, he can make out the unmistakable crackle of a roaring fire. The elder Thomas rushes to the bedroom door and opens it, and is greeted by the terrifying sight of flames at the foot of the stairs, blocking their escape through the door. He slams the door shut before rushing to the window. Unlatching it, he helps his son and daughter out onto the roof of their neighbour's house. But their maid is frozen from fear, too frightened of the flames to risk the stairs, but she also refuses to crawl out onto the thatched roof. Thomas begs her to move, but when she stays stuck to her spot, he forces her from his mind. His children are his priority. The maid, her name lost to history, dies in the flames. As they clamber over the neighbours' roofs, Thomas looks down into his yard. Fire has consumed the wood store, and the flames are already licking at the timber frames of the surrounding walls. Thomas already knows that his home is gone, and probably some of his neighbours as well. He just hopes that the damage isn't too severe. Thomas Farriner has no idea that his bakery is now the ground zero of one of the largest fires in the history of any city. Over the next 4 days, the heart of the City of London will be reduced to ash and rubble. Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 6, The Great Fire of London. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last time, we covered the Great Plague of London, when between 1664 and 1666, a fifth of London's population died, perhaps 100,000 people. Another 100,000 perished as the epidemic spread through England and Wales. Another 200,000 people fled the capital, leaving only 200,000 people. A huge population anywhere else, but it left London a relative ghost town. As 1665 came to an end, Londoners began to return, and though the plague was still claiming lives throughout the summer of 1666, it seemed like London had made it through an apocalypse and was now on the other side. As we also saw, one of our key sources for the plague was Samuel Pepys and his famous diary. Pepys stayed in London for almost the entire epidemic, bound to the capital by his work on the Navy Board. Because even through the ravages of plague, the three kingdoms were still at war with the Dutch Republic, and someone had to keep the war effort going. As far as Pepys was concerned, that was him. As we'll cover when we return to the war with the Dutch, he'd been hard at work trying to supply the Navy. One of the supplies he was responsible for was ship's biscuit, or hardtack. Hardtack, along with salted pork and fish, was one of the staples of any military campaign, but especially for the Navy. It was easy to store, it lasted forever, and it was relatively cheap. Under Pepys's new victualling regulations, each sailor's daily ration included a pound of the stuff. This required a lot of ship's biscuit, and so orders went out to the bakers of London and other port towns, and one of those bakers was Thomas Farriner of Pudding Lane. As we saw in the opening of today's episode, in the wee hours of Sunday the 2nd of September 1666, the Farriners' bakery and house burst into flames. The Farriners managed to escape, although their maid stayed behind and died in the inferno. We don't know her name, but she would be the first person killed by the Great Fire of London. Even as the Farriners were clambering over their neighbours' roofs, those neighbours had already begun to raise the alarm. Shouts of "fire" echoed through the early morning air, and word quickly spread, even as the flames grew higher. Soon enough, the mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was roused from his sleep, and he hurried to the scene. By then, the fire had already spread, despite the efforts of Farriner's neighbours. Fire was very common in any early modern city. Flame was, after all, part of everyday life, the only way to cook food or to heat and light homes and workplaces, and accidents happen. In cities built from fuel, wooden frames, thatch roofs, wattle, tar, a knocked-over candle or the rolling of a burning log could easily mean disaster. So the residents of Pudding Lane weren't just jumping around hooting in confusion about this strange hot light. They knew what to do, and they got to work. Pudding Lane, as a wealthier part of the City of London, had underground pipes which carried water. So paving stones were levered up, and these pipes were smashed open. Leather buckets, specially made for fighting fires, were collected from the parish church. The church warden was responsible for maintaining these, a position Thomas Farriner had held a few years before. It's likely that the buckets carried out of St. Magnus the Martyr were ones he had paid for, and they were now used to put out the fire burning the Farriner house down. Except, they didn't put it out. Despite the efforts of the neighbours, even a few who bravely climbed ladders leaning against the burning building, trying to pour water down onto the fire from above, it just kept burning. So when Bloodworth arrived, the fire was not under control, but instead already beginning to spread. He asked where the fire engines were. These were wooden wagons, filled with water which used pumps to launch it out of hoses. They didn't shoot a lot of water very far, but they did have their uses. These wagons had been sent for, but they hadn't arrived yet. The engines were difficult to push through the narrow, winding alleys around Pudding Lane. Still, the mayor was not overly concerned. The fire was still small, and Bloodworth made the famous and ill-advised comment that, quote, "a woman could piss it out." Other than water, or other liquids, the other best way to stop the spread of fire was to make a fire break, to pull down buildings around the fire. By demolishing these structures, it was much harder for fire to spread. Several people around the mayor told him to give the order, and they would do it. Alongside the leather buckets, all parish churches held long hooks designed for pulling down buildings in a fire. But Bloodworth was reluctant. He was Mayor of London, and after God and the King, his next loyalty was to property. If he started demolishing buildings without permission, God, think of the cost! So, Mayor Bloodworth looked to get that permission from the Farriners' neighbours. But they were just tenants of their buildings. None of the residents of Pudding Lane actually owned their own homes. They just rented them. I know, it's hard to imagine in London, of all places. These tenants gave Bloodworth their permission, but he wouldn't accept it. So people were sent to find the owners of the properties and ask whether they'd prefer their buildings to be demolished or burnt to ash. By the time that permission was received, those buildings were already on fire, and the flames kept spreading. Around 2 hours after the fire first started, and about the same time that Bloodworth arrived on the scene, Samuel Pepys was woken by his maids. They told him that there was a large fire in the city, and so Pepys took a look out of his own window. True enough, he could see the glow of a fire several streets away. But it was several streets away, and it was very early in the morning, and he wanted to go back to bed. So he did. And Pepys wasn't wrong necessarily to be so relaxed about this. Fires were common in cities, and they were always dealt with. A few buildings might be lost to the flames, a few more sacrificed as fire breaks, but he was sure that when he was enjoying his breakfast, all he'd see from his window would be the smoke from a smouldering ruin. It would be something to gossip about at church. But as Pepys slept, the fire didn't go out. Instead, it spread down Fish Street Hill, setting alight every building in its way, and by dawn, a stretch of London from Pudding Lane to the River Thames was an inferno. Once the fire reached the riverside, the dawn winds combined with the river's breeze. The flames would have jumped across the Thames over London Bridge if it hadn't been for a fire 3 decades earlier. That blaze had left a gap in the bridge's buildings which had never been refilled, and now it acted as a firebreak. Because of this coincidence, the South Bank was spared destruction. The same could not be said for the North. Running alongside the river from which it took its name, Thames Street was a commercial powerhouse. At the end closest to London Bridge sat Fishmongers' Hall, a grand guild hall built under the Tudors. Both sides of Thames Street were packed with warehouses, and those warehouses were packed with goods, brought to London for export or imported from near and far. Olive oil, tar, pitch, timber, wine and brandy, hemp and flax, spices, saltpetre, furs, wool and linen and silk. When the fire reached Thames Street, it gorged on all of this. St. Magnus the Martyr, the Farriners' parish church, was the first of London's churches to be claimed by the fire. It was far from the last. Members of the Fishmongers' Guild, some still in their pyjamas, had managed to rescue the most important documents and most valuable items from the Fishmongers' Hall, but the grand building itself was soon consumed by the flames, and they sprinted along Thames Street. Crates of spices which cost more than several labourers' annual income were incinerated. Barrels of oil exploded, spraying liquid fire all around. Timber, fated for the Royal Navy, burned to ash. Alongside this immense wealth lived merchant families and the poor in almshouses. They all fled, homeless but alive. Samuel Pepys awoke at 7 a.m. to the air smelling distinctly smoky, and his maids, who hadn't slept, now informed him that the fire hadn't been put out. It had spread. 300 houses had been destroyed, and last they'd heard, Fish Street and London Bridge had been claimed by the inferno. As he had shown during the plague, Pepys was not one to sit on the sidelines or run away from a crisis. He got dressed and set out from his Seething Lane house to the closest place he could get a good vantage point, the Tower of London. He climbed the White Tower, and he later described seeing an infinite great fire along the River Thames. Not satisfied that he had enough information, he descended the tower and boarded a boat, sailing up the Thames towards London Bridge. The smell of smoke was intense, but it was only after they passed underneath the bridge and got a clear view of Thames Street that Pepys realised how much destruction the fire had already caused. The huge warehouses and the fishmonger's hall, not to mention the northern third of London Bridge itself, were either burning or already smoking ruins. The fire was still spreading. Besides the obvious inferno, Pepys also witnessed thousands of Londoners dragging carts or boxes through the streets, or stacking crates of goods into riverboats, all desperate to save whatever goods or property they could. That was all normal and understandable. But what Pepys didn't see was anyone actually fighting the fire. What the hell was Mayor Bloodworth doing? Appalled at this apparent inaction, Pepys had the boatmen keep rowing. Someone had to tell the king. With the benefit of 300 years hindsight, we can be a bit sympathetic to Bloodworth's situation. As we saw, early in the fire, he felt he could not pull down properties without permission, and that permission was nowhere to be found. His position as mayor didn't give him that much executive authority. And besides, those property owners were his constituents. He'd been elected by the wealthy merchants of London. Also, Bloodworth had to handle a fire which had broken out at perhaps the worst time. On a Sunday morning, most Londoners would not be at work. They'd be enjoying a well-deserved lie-in on their one day off a week. On the morning of a workday, not only would there be more people in the streets, but the authorities would be able to react quicker. Bloodworth was hampered by a lack of manpower. The City of London could, in theory, call on 800 men for emergencies like this. But that wasn't many, and as the fire spread, a lot of them were more interested in preserving their own goods than assisting the mayor. As Bloodworth would tell Pepys later in the morning, people were not listening to him. Instead of coming together to fight the fire, the vast majority of Londoners were prioritising their own property or the assets of their companies. Others seem to have been overwhelmed by the fire. John Evelyn, another key source of the fire, wrote that, quote, "The conflagration was so universal and the people so astonished that from the beginning they hardly stirred to quench it." End quote. Back to Pepys. He sailed up the Thames to Whitehall Palace, and there he met with the King and the Duke of York. Pepys believed that he was the first person to tell the royal brothers what was happening in their capital city, and to their credit, they took his report seriously. Pepys was not a man to mince his words, especially when he believed he knew what had to be done. So despite not knowing much about fires, he told Charles and James that only by pulling down houses could the fire be stopped. The king told Pepys to find Bloodworth and tell him to, quote, "spare no houses, but to pull down before the fire every way," end quote. Technically, the City of London was outside of Charles's jurisdiction, but in an emergency like this, no one was consulting medieval charters. York took Pepys to one side and told him, on the down low, that if the mayor needed soldiers, he would get them. So Pepys set off, by coach this time, back along the river, on the hunt for the mayor. It's important to emphasise how slow information was spreading, even when we're talking about an enormous fire in the centre of a city. When Pepys was informing the court, there were still church services being held in Westminster like it was any other Sunday. Westminster Abbey was full of people, and one of our sources, a schoolboy named William Taswell, was standing by the pulpit. This gave him a great view of the back of the congregation, where news was spreading like wildfire, pun intended. Young William watched as the churchgoers began talking amongst themselves in a wave spreading from the main doors. And then people started to leave. And not calmly, like they would to escape from a particularly boring sermon. No, these people were running down the aisle and out into the street. William weighed up whether to stay by the minister or find out what was happening. Of course, he went to see what was happening. William watched as 4 boats, crowded with refugees covered in blankets, rowed upstream. They were the first of many. Pepys's carriage might have passed by William Tazwell as it rolled from Whitehall Palace to St. Paul's Cathedral on Cannon Street. At the great church, he had to continue on foot because the tide of people and goods flowing away from the flames was too much for the carriage. As he disembarked, he saw people carrying boxes into the cathedral. These were London's booksellers and the stationers' company. The thick medieval stone walls and the underground crypts beneath its floors were understandably seen as the safest place to store these flammable items. Every available space in the crypt was filled with boxes of books, manuscripts, and letters. This was only a precaution. The fire was still several streets away, and the thick stone walls would surely be the best defence against the heat. Pepys eventually found Bloodworth on Canning Street, where the mayor was doing what he could. It was after 11 a.m. now, and Pepys presented Bloodworth with the king's order to do what needed to be done to stop the fire. I imagine that Bloodworth was only stopped from strangling the arrogant bookkeeper because he was so tired. Instead, he, according to Pepys, cried like a fainting woman. As he told the diarist, he'd already been doing what needed to be done. He'd been ordering buildings pulled down, sod permission. It hadn't been enough. By the time they got one building down, the fire had already spread. The problem, Bloodworth told Pepys, was manpower. Quote, "I am spent. People will not obey me." End quote. Then he went to get some sleep. He had been up since 2 in the morning, and even Pepys realised the man was exhausted, but this did nothing for his later reputation. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Bloodworth slept. In the afternoon, Charles and York sailed down the Thames on the royal barge and stopped at Queenhithe, right by St. Paul's. Of course, Bloodworth was nowhere to be seen. Instead, they found Pepys, who was once again told the king's orders: pull down any building that needed pulling down, and to spread the word. The royal brothers did not stay long, but they had brought the Earl of Craven, along with a few sailors, to help the mayor. Craven was a good choice, because he seems to have held a fascination with fire. His biographer, R. Malcolm Smuts, describes how he would rush outside to spectate fires at whatever time of day or night. He even had a horse specially trained to follow the smell of smoke. This aristocratic pyromaniac jumped into action. But despite the king's orders, by midnight of Sunday the 2nd of September, the Great Fire of London showed no signs of stopping. Around a quarter of the city of London was on fire. If the heavens had suddenly opened and rain had doused the flames, it would already have been the most destructive fire in anyone's memory. But this was just the first day. Encouraged by the easterly wind, the fire kept burning and consuming its way west. Along with fire and the smoke, the noise is something that comes through the sources. The screams and shouts of people as they rushed to save their homes and livelihoods, and usually failing. The crash of collapsing roofs and walls, the occasional metallic thud of a bell falling from a crumbling church tower, and through it all, the sound of crackling fire as it devoured a city turned into kindling by a long, hot summer. On the second day of the fire, Monday the 3rd of September, Mayor Bloodworth was sacked. Not from his position as mayor, his term would end next month anyway, but he was replaced as the man in charge of fighting the fire. His space was taken by the Duke of York, James Stuart. York was many things, and he had many faults, but he was a good man to have in charge of a crisis. he had battlefield experience, a casual authority, which simply assumed that his orders would be followed, and of course, he was second in line to the throne. When he gave orders, men obeyed. Within hours of taking charge, York ordered that several command posts be set up around the city, each staffed by parish constables and backed up by 100 men from the city, as well as 30 soldiers. These men were paid and fed, and anyone who did their job well would be paid an extra shilling. To ensure that orders would be followed, York sent courtiers out into the city to lend their names and authority to these posts. Men like the Earl of Manchester and the future Earl of Shaftesbury. Reinforcements were called in from the naval ports of Deptford and Woolwich, and 2 companies of trained bands were raised and stationed to guard the suburbs of the city. Public order would be maintained, and these garrisons would act as safe zones where fleeing Londoners could leave their property with relative confidence that they wouldn't be nicked. Even schoolboys were drafted into the effort. William Taswell was one of them, conscripted by the Dean of Westminster School. The fire had gotten out of hand because of a lack of coordination and a lack of manpower. York was determined to fix both issues, and he had far more power than Bloodworth to get it done. With this new organisation and influx of hands, buildings all across London were demolished. But by the afternoon of the second day, the flames were still spreading. Now that the fire was so enormous, the wind could easily carry embers over gaps between buildings, sometimes even over fire breaks. Workers might pull a house down into rubble, only to turn around and find the fire had already bypassed them. These apparently spontaneous fires only added to the ugliest side of the Great Fire: scapegoating. In the panicked atmosphere, it didn't take much to start pointing fingers, and it was the foreigners who were targeted first. London had a sizable population of Dutch and French people, courtesy of the city's international importance. Both countries were at war with England. We'll cover France's entry into the war another time. And Sir Robert Holmes had successfully burned a huge Dutch merchant fleet just weeks before. Could this be revenge, sabotage, arson? That would explain how the fire had spread so quickly, and how new fires seemed to spring up beyond the fire breaks. Individual foreigners were attacked or arrested, and they didn't need to be Dutch or French. Any accent, clothing, or appearance that seemed foreign was enough to put you in danger. When some Italian diplomats went out into the streets, they went carrying swords for their own protection. In the chaos of the evacuation, there was more than a little opportunism going around. Many people came into London from the suburbs to help, but not all of them were willing to do it for free. Boatmen, coachmen, and carters all hiked their prices, with some charging £30 for a single load of goods. This was extortionate, quite literally, but London's wealthier citizens were able, and begrudgingly willing, to pay. Naturally, not all of these porters were above board. Some disappeared with the goods, or ditched them after being paid. There were others who skipped the grift entirely, and simply looted and stole from abandoned houses and piled up goods. Witnesses standing on the south bank of the Thames could only see fire and smoke from Cheapside to Baynard's Castle. Lombard Street, home to some of London's wealthiest merchants, was consumed, and soon the Royal Exchange itself was destroyed. As night fell on the second day of the Great Fire, there was still no end in sight. On the morning of the third day, Tuesday, the 4th of September, anyone who had managed to catch some sleep woke to find that Cheapside was gone. Despite the name, it was one of the wealthiest parts of the city, the home of goldsmiths and silk merchants for centuries. Most of the occupants had had time to evacuate their movable goods, but you couldn't move the Guildhall. The grand building caught light and was seriously damaged, but it wasn't entirely destroyed. Charles, at Whitehall Palace on the other side of the city, confirmed with his brother that the fire was not contained, so he gave 2 orders. The first was to the Duke of Albemarle, George Monk, who was currently with the fleet. The Lord General was recalled to London to take command of the soldiers and ensure that public order was maintained. The second order was to Charles's servants. Pack up my stuff. Because that morning, one of their assumptions had been proven false. The River Fleet, which flows into the Thames, was believed to be too wide for the fire to cross. Well, Fleet Street was now in flames. If the wind kept up, it was entirely possible that Westminster would be threatened. So as a precaution, royal servants began packing up the most valuable items from Whitehall Palace and carting them off to Hampton Court. Nearby houses around the palace were pulled down, even though the fire was still far off. York's own command post was at Temple Bar, but he could do little as the flames reached Bridewell Prison, and in the evening of Tuesday, St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's had had a rough century. 100 years before, in 1561, lightning had destroyed the steeple, and it was 70 years before an effort was made to restore it under Charles I. Work began in 1630, but was suspended during the Civil Wars, and stopped during the Republic. You might recall that I mentioned that soldiers were billeted in the cathedral, lighting a fire in its centre. With the restoration, the famed architect Christopher Wren was brought in to restart the work. We'll hear a lot more about Wren next episode. £6,000 were raised to cover the costs of the building, and in the summer of 1666, the scaffolding went up. And the scaffolding was still there when the Great Fire arrived. The wooden frame was just what the flames wanted, and soon the whole cathedral was ablaze. The windows shattered first. Then the roof, made of timber, slate, and lead, caught fire, and then the walls began to crack. Then the roof came in. Burning timbers, molten lead, and hot stone tumbled inwards, bringing the walls down with them. They hit the flagstones and went right through them, down into the crypts below St. Paul's Cathedral. Crypts which were full to the brim with paper and books, stored there by the stationer's company in the belief that this was safe. An avalanche of burning debris destroyed everything inside, and only burnt scraps would be recovered from the rubble. Throughout this third day, the royal brothers rode all over the city, giving orders and lending authority where they could, thanking firefighters and, it seems, at one point helping pull down some buildings. Charles commanded that barrels of gunpowder be brought in to help demolish buildings faster, and soon explosions boomed out over the city. The Stuart brothers were not just fighting to save London, they were fighting to keep the throne. London was only 6 years into the Restoration, and no one, especially not Charles, was blind to how important controlling the capital was. This fire could easily spell the end of his rule, if his subjects believed he'd been complacent. There were already tens of thousands of people in the fields around London, an army of the homeless and hopeless. That was why Charles had recalled Albemarle, a man respected by the city and the troops, and who was loyal to the crown. His authority would be useful in fighting the fire, but it would be invaluable to maintain the peace once it was out. Elsewhere in the city, Pepys was sitting in his garden on Seething Lane. He'd spent most of his goods outside of the city, and Pepys had been running from one side of London to the other, helping to coordinate the response. He was so exhausted, he wasn't sure what day it was. He'd caught up with Sir William Penn, and the two men agreed that the Navy Board had to be preserved. If the fire reached its records, the war effort would be devastated. Pepys sent a request for permission to pull down the buildings around the offices. Then he got on his hands and knees and began to dig 2 holes. Into one was placed his official and personal papers, and into the other went his wine and cheese. Pepys and his wife stayed the night, but at 2 a.m, they awoke with the fire just streets away. The Pepys took what they suspected would be their last look at their home before setting off for Woolwich. On this eastern side of the fire, the main focus of defence was the Tower of London. Not only was the tower a symbol of royal authority and an essential military installation, but it was also crammed full of gunpowder. If the flames reached that, pieces of the White Tower, and anyone nearby, would be scattered all over southern England. Fortunately for everyone, the wind was pushing against the fire here. The breeze which had doomed St. Paul's and now threatened Westminster saved the Tower of London, and the fire breaks did their job. In fact, at 11 p.m, that wind suddenly died. At this crucial moment, with firefighting efforts fully underway, with thousands of people demolishing buildings all around it, the Great Fire lost its momentum. It was still a raging inferno, but the worst of it was now over. The anti-foreigner hysteria reached a fever pitch at this point, with rumours that tens of thousands of French and Dutch immigrants were preparing to attack the dispossessed Londoners sheltering in the suburbs. It was only by the effort of the trained bands and a general proclamation from the king that foreigners were not to blame that a general massacre of anyone with a foreign accent was prevented. On the fourth day, Wednesday, Pepys returned to London. The diarist had resigned himself to the destruction of his home. Thousands others had suffered the same fate after all. The paving stones were hot enough to burn his feet through his shoes, but to his relief, his house had been spared. Through this last day, the fire gradually burned itself out, starved of fuel by the efforts of thousands of people under the direction of York. Whenever the flames began to pick up again, it was the Duke who rode to the scene and oversaw its suppression. When the sun set on Wednesday, it was the first night since Sunday morning that London wasn't lit by flame. There were still small fires, along with countless smoking embers, but the Great Fire of London was over. Next time, we will cover the aftermath. What was left of England's capital city? How would it be rebuilt? Would it even be rebuilt? What was the cost in houses, churches, money, and lives? Apologies for this episode's delay. There has been a loss in the family, and we are still processing it. Thank you for your patience. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Fiona, Marchioness of Kilcullen, Earl Aslag, Countess Laura Vu, Earl Robert Brucato, Earl Joshua Evans Lovell, Earl Harry McClendon, and Earl Jim Eaton Terry. They join my existing supporters, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, the Duchess of Devon Michelle Gersich, the Marquess of Hampton Alexander Travis, and the Earl of Lonsdale Bill Norris. Thank you to all of my patrons who have received this episode and every other episode ad-free. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica for more information. Thanks also to everyone who has left reviews on Apple Podcasts and comments on Spotify. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.